Hey everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Jessie Nealand, and today I'm going to share with you an excerpt from my monthly community Zoom call. So these are live calls that I host for everybody in my Patreon community who subscribes at the $5 a month level or higher. And they're for us to come together and unpack interesting and relevant topics through an empowering, intersectionally feminist, and body neutral lens. So in past months, we've covered topics like Botox and fillers. That was a really good one. Body checking, jealousy, and emotional labor. So you kind of get a theme. And this month, we dove deep into the topic of victimhood, what it means, why people seem to get so mad about it, and what the actual difference is between really being a victim and having a victim mentality. So normally these are closed calls that I only share with my Patreon community, but before opening up the conversation to the live participants in the call, I usually get us started with a little presentation on the topic. And I've decided that that part of the call is something I'm going to share with you today because I think this topic is so important. It's so interesting and nuanced, and it's so misunderstood. So I want more of us to be talking about it. If you enjoy this video, you will probably love the live community calls. So go ahead and give it a like and comment, and then head over to my Patreon page to subscribe at the $5 a month level or higher, and you will get access to the live call every month so that you can join in the discussion and connect with me and other like-minded people who want to talk about this kind of stuff. And you'll also get access to the full call recording to watch or listen afterward at your own pace. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome. Today we're talking about victimhood, and I had a really good time putting the notes together. I mean, it's kind of a dark topic, but I was down a rabbit hole and really enjoyed it. So I'm excited to talk about this today. I wanted to start by giving some definitions because I think to understand victimhood, we first have to understand the difference between like being a victim and always feeling like a victim or having what's called like a victim mindset or a victim mentality. So starting with the definition of a victim is just someone who's been harmed, injured, or killed as the result of an event, crime, accident, or action. Very straightforward, somebody whose rights have been violated. And this is inherently in the definition, and I did have to look it up because I was like, how are we technically defining this? It doesn't name this in the definition anywhere, but I think we all understand that there's inherently an element of blamelessness or helplessness to somebody who we would consider a victim. Like there has to be a clear lack of liability on the victim's part for us to all agree that they were a victim. Which is why we often use the word in the case of somebody who's been like tricked or misled, manipulated, or duped in some way. We'll say like the victim of a scam or something like that. So often there's also an element of surprise involved in that the victim didn't see whatever the thing was coming and therefore couldn't prepare for it, couldn't prevent it. It's almost like we're most inclined to call them a victim if we see them as utterly helpless to the circumstance. So for this reason, there's a general consensus that someone was the victim of like a violent crime or a natural disaster or a scam or a hoax. But we're a little more hesitant to call somebody the victim of a circumstance that we think they helped to create or that they chose to be a part of. So if the person is perceived to be accountable for whatever the bad thing was in some way, calling them a victim can become kind of controversial or divisive, which is why a lot of people might not consider a woman the victim of like sexual harassment if she dressed or acted a certain way, because in their perception, she helped create the situation. It's not cut and dry that she was blameless. And that's why there's a lot of debate around whether or not someone who, chooses to stay with an abusive partner, for example, are they really the victim? Like, I certainly know how I stand on things like that, but that's why we see that stuff being debated. Whereas I've never seen anyone debate whether or not someone was a victim of like a hurricane, because they didn't see it coming. There was nothing they could do. It's all very cut and dry that they were blameless. On the flip side of the victimhood coin is someone with a victim mentality. So this is often called victim mindset and sometimes referred to by people saying like, oh, they were playing the victim or they see themselves as a victim. And the definition here, we're really referring to someone who routinely sees themselves as the victim of other people's negative actions, even when there's evidence to the contrary. So that is the big difference between an actual victim and someone with a victim mentality, is that there is an element of delusionalness to the victim mindset, or at least that's how it's perceived or how it's sort of intended to be used. And granted, there's some nuance here in that somebody who is said to be playing the victim can also refer to a person who is trying to present themselves as a victim to make themselves appear sympathetic or manipulate people. But I do think that's a little bit different. Like somebody who plays the victim is sort of doing a scam of their own, if you will. Like that's how we see it. We see it as somebody who's trying to manipulate to make themselves seem more sympathetic and get people to feel for them. Whereas someone who just has a victim mentality, they're not necessarily trying to scam anyone. They just often are very deeply stuck in a negative view of life. They often feel very helpless, like they have no control over what happens to them. They tend to blame other people for everything and like rarely or never take responsibility for their own actions. And in that way, they are very difficult people to be in relationship with. And I think we all kind of know that, which is why we tend to have a pretty negative view of people who we see as always being in that victim mentality space, is like they're not necessarily going to feel empowered to make their lives better and take accountability for the role that they play. They're just going to shit talk everyone and everything and talk about how like it's not fair. And it's a very draining energy. So the big difference in how we view victims versus people with a victim mentality is depends on the situation. So in situations where the victim is 100% indisputably blameless, as I said, like a natural disaster, for example, or a violent crime, we as a culture generally view them very sympathetically. Our hearts go out to them. We empathize with them. We think about, oh my God, that would have been so horrible. And we may even sometimes place them on like a weird moral pedestal, like especially if the bad thing that happened while they were showing up for something that we see as particularly righteous. So for example, like a soldier who goes to war and ends up with PTSD from that because he was out there fighting for our country, which we tend to think of as morally righteous. Then for him to have gotten this thing that was completely not his fault, but is screwing his life up, we're a lot more likely in that kind of case, not just to view him sympathetically, but also to sort of almost make him like a hero. And I think we see that as well with things like cancer survivors, or there's a lot of situations where it's like indisputably, 100% indisputably blameless, and we sort of put them on a pedestal in some ways. And in situations where there's controversy, so this is anything below 100%, basically, controversy over the person's role in the bad thing that happened, they will often receive a volatile mix of responses. They will get some sympathy and empathy from the people who have taken in whatever the story is and decided that they're blameless. And then some blame and outrage and vitriol. And this outrage is the result of people being mad when they see the person, what they have decided. They see a person who is unjustly or inappropriately receiving the sympathy or empathy that is appropriate to an actual victim, and they've decided this person isn't an actual victim, therefore they're pissed. And honestly, people get weirdly possessive over their own sympathy. It's a strange thing to think about, but like a lot of people really only want to give sympathy to people they've decided are worthy receivers and have very strong opinions about who is and isn't worthy of their sympathy. And then they'll get super mad if they accidentally give it to someone who later turns out not to meet their worthiness standards. It's a whole thing, which is part of what I was like going down the rabbit hole about. I was like, what is going on psychologically with this pattern? But I think we see it all the time, right? Like in the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp hearings, some people saw Amber as the helpless or blameless victim of domestic abuse. And so they saw her very sympathetically as the victim. Other people were seeing her, I guess, as like half of a toxic dynamic, either a person who chose to stay in a toxic relationship or even helped create and progress the toxic dynamic. So they didn't see her as blameless. And it became like there was so much hatred and vitriol for Amber. And it in the media, it just became a circus of people who were like really furious at her for pretending to be a victim as they saw it. And each side weirdly was really mad at each other. Like people who saw her as a victim were furious with the other side for piling on hate, which makes sense to me. And then people who were piling on hate were furious with the people who were being sympathetic because in their view, like, how could you give your precious sympathy away to someone who's undeserving? So in this way, all of this is to say just that victims are often treated with a lot of suspicion, and they're often dismissed, invalidated, or not believed if there is anything in their narrative that makes people feel like it's below 100% blameless. And of course, everyone's going to have a different standard for what that means and what that looks like and what qualifies. On the other side, how we view people with a victim mentality, like understandably, based on how difficult it can be to be around a person who is just never taking accountability for their actions and is a super negative view of life and all of that stuff, we as a culture have a pretty negative view of these people because they're toxic and honestly, they're annoying and they're exhausting to deal with. So it's considered like a character flaw sometimes. It's considered a sign of mental weakness at times, anywhere ranging, I would say, from like a lack of self-awareness to like psychopathy, like a narcissistic monster, and then all the way up to a monster with like nefarious or malicious intent at worst would be someone who, again, is sort of using this victim mentality to cause harm or maybe so lacking in self-awareness that it just causes a lot of harm and chaos in their lives and then in the lives of other people. And the fact that blame and fault tends to be determined in the eye of the beholder makes it so that when we're really talking about a person who has this pattern of having a victim mentality, it makes sense for us to have a negative view of them. But also, we take that negative view and we aim it directly at people who are actual victims a lot of the times when that person is considered in any way at fault or liable for the bad thing that happened to them. So unfortunately, real victims are often sort of doubly victimized by people who have decided that they're not victim enough and then sort of cast aspersions and like label them with this playing the victim or victim mindset thing as an insult, because that's how we understand it in our society, is like it's a bad thing to be. And the most detestable thing of all in our view as a society is like a psychopathic monster who has malicious intent, who is trying to scam people almost out of sympathy. That it's almost like the the idea that like life is not pie, like there is no actual zero sum amount of sympathy that you can give the world. But I think in this belief system, it often is viewed as if like you gave sympathy to the wrong person, so you have stolen it from a real victim. And I think that's often how we see a lot of the vitriol toward people who were actually victims in some way, getting a lot of hatred and suspicion. So highly unfortunate, but people who are suspicious of a victim because they believe that they weren't appropriately blameless will often accuse them of having a victim mentality, giving them the unfortunate title or insult of this. It affords them an easy explanation. I mean, it's a really easy way to dismiss someone and invalidate someone's story. And so I think part of the most dangerous or nefarious aspect of this whole topic is that when you pile on this negative view of people who come forward with some kind of story, it makes people less likely to come forward and tell their stories and tell the truth. And therefore, it is a very effective way of controlling people, because you know that someone who comes forward with a story, let's say, you know, a celebrity sexually assaulted me, like that's the story. A person comes forward, they know, given our society and the way we view this kind of stuff, they know that they have to appear at least to be 100% blameless in order to be given any kind of credibility. And that includes like emotionally in terms of support from whoever is listening to this story and also legally. But it also means that there's a pretty big chance that they're going to get a lot of hate, right? They're going to get threats. They're going to get anger. They're going to like get outrage. Not even because people don't necessarily believe them, but because people perceive them as having, you know, almost like trying to steal sympathy from them, to manipulate them out of their sympathy or kindness. So it's a very effective way to block people from telling their stories. It's a very effective punishment or threat. The way we view victim mentality stuff as so negative, it keeps people from owning the ways in which they actually were a victim. And a lot of stories are more nuanced and complex than this black and white 100% or anything else. So it keeps people from holding those who cause harm accountable. And that makes me so angry. Um, but it's a little bit of like the Madonna whore complex. Like it's a way of people keeping people down and controlled, giving them two options. You have two options. You're either a saint who this horrible thing happened to and you couldn't stop it and there's absolutely nothing you could have done, and we'll put you on this moral pedestal and we'll call you a hero for telling your story. Or literally, if you have any hint of anything that goes against that shiny perfect story, then you're going to be a detestable fraudster who we hate and want to take down. It is a dangerous place to tell your story, which makes people less likely to speak up. So that's where I wanted to start and kind of just get the conversation going from there, because honestly, like I said, it's dark as hell when you really think about it that way. And a little bit more psychologically strange than I maybe originally thought before I started making these notes. So it's like, what is going on with us as a society? So let me just open the floor and any thoughts, stories, questions?
That's it. I hope you enjoyed this excerpt. This little presentation was just the beginning of the conversation. So there's a lot I can't share here, but we went on to talk about the topic in a lot more depth, including how people have such a hard time holding space for nuance and complexity, and how that leads them to see everything in this very black and white binary of like good versus bad or saintly victim versus manipulative monster, as well as how obsessing over who does and doesn't qualify for this sort of gate-kept label of victim actually just keeps us from focusing on the real topic at hand, which is the fact that someone has been harmed. So to watch the whole community call recording and also to get access to future calls like this, go ahead and join my Patreon community at the $5 a month level or higher now. And of course, if you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out when I post videos. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching.